to welcome you guys to Coop's second official webinar of the year. Just to give you guys a brief introduction, my name is Marijke Steenvaart and I'm going to be your moderator for today. In case you're not familiar with Coop, we're a multidisciplinary initiative being led by academics at the University of Pretoria, and we work in partnership with various private industry or like actors in the private industry. And I would love to welcome our attendees and our great panelists. I would also like to apologize for Mafalda Pardal, who was one of the panelists, but couldn't make it today due to some personal reasons. But I would like to welcome the rest of our panelists, Professor De Corte, from Ghent University, Cobus Skuman, who is the CEO and founder of Goa, Neil Little, who is the owner of the THC Club, and Andrew McPherson, who is the lawyer for THC. Welcome, guys, and thank you. I think we have a really great panel today, but one of the things you can notice is that we're an all-white panel, and that's because the industry at this stage is, or the sector is very white at this stage, and we need to seriously consider ways of improving the diversity. And we'll focus in on ways to do that later in the webinar, but then I would also like to just give a brief introduction to those who aren't familiar with Cannabis Social Clubs. It's also what is often referred to as private grow clubs, and it's a specific mode of distributing recreational cannabis or cannabis for recreational use, which is different from other distribution networks that have been operating in South Africa. But in order not to take up much time, I would like to hand over this discussion, or have Professor De Corte open the discussion on cannabis clubs and give us more of an international context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marijke, and thank you very much to the organizers of this webinar to have invited me here and to share some of our work with this panel and with the participants in this seminar. So if you don't mind, I will start sharing my screen, because I prepared a few slides to accompany the things that I wanted to talk about today. So if that's okay. Let's see. I hope that's visible to you all. If not, I'll probably hear somebody say something or wave, but I assume that you can see these slides. So just as a brief introduction, my name is Tom De Corte, and I'm a professor of criminology at Ghent University in Belgium. And I'm the director of a research group called the Institute for Social Drug Research, which has been studying all aspects of the drug phenomena in our society, so including legal and illegal drugs, and of course also the societal responses to the whole phenomenon. And I'd like to start with some very general observations. It's quite clear to me and to many other academics, and there seems to be a growing consensus that the traditional strategy of prohibition has failed, and in fact makes a lot of things related to the phenomenon much worse. So there seems to be a consensus about the fact that cannabis prohibition, or that the prohibitionist system has failed. We've tried that strategy for over 50 years, and it's clear that it doesn't give us any tools and instruments to get a better grip and a better control on the phenomenon. And in the past 15 years, we've seen several countries and several states evolving towards another system, another strategy, often referred to as legalization or regulating with cannabis. One could say that, as opposed to some years ago, the world has become a laboratory for experiments with regulating cannabis. And this is quite different than, let's say, 20 or 25 years ago, when those countries that started talking or thinking or speaking out loud about legalizing cannabis were immediately pinpointed by the international community. And the climate today is totally different. When a country or a state decides to regulate cannabis, the reaction is no longer a reaction of sanctioning, of stigmatizing, of pinpointing to that country, but actually being very curious about how a country will deal with the problem and what will happen in a few years' time after this new regime has been implemented. And when you look at the history, the recent history of countries and states legalizing cannabis, you can also see around the world the importance of bottom-up and grassroots initiatives. And I'd like to talk or take my time here to talk a little bit about one particular grassroots initiative or bottom-up initiative, which is the Cannabis Social Clubs model. I will talk a little bit about the dangers of over-commercialization. But first, I need to share this slide with you to show you that in the international scientific literature, when a country or a state starts thinking about an alternative model for the prohibition model, it seems that often one model is picked out and debated the most, which is the standard commercial model. Many people think that once you start legalizing cannabis, you will, or that a country will regulate it like we regulated alcohol and like we regulated tobacco in the past. But what many people don't seem to know is that in between the two extremes of prohibition and increased sanctions on the one hand, and a standard commercialized model like we have for alcohol and tobacco, that there are many what we would call in-between scenarios or middle ground options. And the Cannabis Social Club model is one and probably the most famous in-between or middle ground option. And that's what I want to talk about with you today. I do this, and I have been spending a lot of years studying the Cannabis Social Club model because I do think this model has a lot of potential. Because the commercial model, as we know it for tobacco, as for alcohol, as for prescription drugs, have clearly illustrated that when you choose to legalize a substance and turn it into a commercial model, it already illustrates that legalizing and regulating creates a lot of legislative instruments that can be used to influence the phenomenon in the right way. And we know that with alcohol, there are age limits, there are quality standards, there's rules about advertising and marketing. For example, there's a restriction on tobacco advertising, etc. So these commercial models already show that once you legalize and regulate a phenomenon, you as a government, as an authority, you do have a lot of legislative instruments that can be very helpful in protecting public health, much more than the prohibitionist model. But on the other hand, choosing a commercial model has also shown, so there's historical lessons to be drawn from our experience with the alcohol industry, with big tobacco, with big pharma, that once you create a commercial model, especially a very unrestricted commercial model, that you create new dangers for public health. Because we have seen big tobacco, big alcohol, and big pharma using a lot of techniques to try to minimize and disguise the health risks of the products they were selling, trying to influence the scientific research, even bribing or corrupting scientists. Of course, we have seen these industries to pursue a very aggressive marketing strategy. They are unstoppable in their search for new target groups and profitable branding, and they continue to develop products that are particularly appealing to very young people. And they have always, as industries, shown a great resistance to measures that try to restrict the supply of these substances. So that is exactly why I want to raise the question. It is a good idea to legalize and to regulate a product like cannabis. There's no doubt about it. But an important question is, do you really want to create a commercial model? Is this really the type of market you want to create? And in the international literature, it is often pointed out that once you create a very commercial model, the damages, the harms, the health harms on the social and on the health level may be as high as when they are when the product is prohibited and when an illegal market is. So there's a lot of voices in the academic literature that point at the fact that it's probably the most ideal scenario for regulating and legalizing cannabis and maybe other products is a legal regulation, but a very strict regulation. And so these cannabis social clubs may be a very interesting model. Just to point out, what is a cannabis social club? It's an association of cannabis users who collectively grow or cultivate cannabis in a private space, not to sell to anybody, so not for profit. They are producing limited amounts, covering the personal consumption needs by the members, by the people that have registered as member of these associations. And we have seen in different countries in Europe that there are that cannabis social clubs could supply cannabis for recreational purposes, but also for medical purposes. I'm going to not elaborate too much on the phenomenon, because I think that after we have had all the input of all the panelists and we have had some questions from the panel, we can dive into more deeply into some aspects. The main thing I want to point out here is that in Europe, we have seen the emergence of different types of cannabis social clubs. In every case, these cannabis social clubs emerged in gray legal areas. So there's no country in Europe where the model of cannabis social clubs was legally regulated. Even in Spain, where there are now hundreds of cannabis social clubs and the phenomenon has been tolerated for many years to a certain extent, it has never been legally regulated. There have been some regional parliaments in Spain who tried to regulate the phenomenon, who actually drafted legislation to regulate the cannabis social clubs, sorry. But these legislations were never implemented because the regional parliaments got into a conflict with the central parliament of Madrid on the federal level, who claimed they did not have the competencies to legally regulate a phenomenon like this. And the fact that it is emerging in a gray legal area, so left unregulated, turns it into a very highly volatile phenomenon. For example, in Belgium, we've had a period of 10, 15 years where the cannabis social clubs were tolerated somehow and were left to operate without any legal framework. But once a new discourse, governmental discourse of a war on drugs and zero tolerance and non-tolerance for cannabis arose, these clubs were again targeted by police and by justice and were heavily criminalized. And nowadays, there are almost no active cannabis social clubs left in my own country. This is just a map to show you. We've published several articles and we did a study to try to map the phenomenon in Europe. I will refer to some of the references later on. Having said something about the phenomenon of cannabis social clubs in Europe, I'd like to point out that at this point in time, there is one particular country, Uruguay, where cannabis social clubs are a legally regulated model. So up to today, it's the only country where cannabis social clubs are operating within a legal framework, limiting what they can do and telling them what they have to do in order to establish a cannabis social club and get a license as a cannabis social club. So that's why we also, in some of our publications, compared the practices of the cannabis social clubs in Uruguay, where it is regulated, as compared to Spain and Belgium, where it is unregulated. And it's very important. This is actually my main point of what I wanted to bring into the debate, is that as long as you do not regulate cannabis social club as a model and you do not define legally their rights and their obligations, you will see that the phenomenon can go in any possible direction. And this is a slide that or a figure that I borrowed from my colleague Mafalda Pardal, who unfortunately could not be present today, but who wrote a PhD on cannabis social clubs and who published several articles. In one of those articles, she created a typology of cannabis social clubs, illustrating the enormous variety in practices on the ground and also the different directions that a cannabis social club can evolve into when there is no legal framework. Because cannabis social clubs can be run by professional staff, they can be run by volunteer staff, they can only function as a supplier, as a dispensary, but they can also take up activist roles. They seem to be non-profit, and officially they are non-profit, but if you leave them unregulated, it's bound to happen that some cannabis social clubs will evolve into some commercial enterprise. And of course, if it's not regulated, the phenomenon will always stay to a certain extent underground. You can have small and larger cannabis social clubs. You can have single unit cannabis social clubs that just serve medical cannabis users or recreational users. But there's cannabis social clubs. We've seen cannabis social clubs that have a medical unit, that have a recreational unit, etc. So I could go on for a much longer time to show you the diversity, but I do think that my main message is that if you are interested in this model, it's very important to look at the experience of Uruguay, which is the only country that has a legal system of cannabis social clubs. It's obviously very interesting to look at the drafted regulations of these regional parliaments in Spain, but keep in mind that these regulations have never been implemented. And that, of course, the cannabis social clubs, as a grassroots movement in Europe, have also developed their own self-regulatory practices, their own protocol, which is worth looking at. And obviously, even when you think about this model, it's important to gain some insights and learn lessons from other models of regulations. The interesting part of cannabis social clubs that it does offer the opportunity to involve cannabis users' communities and not only white business people into the field once it's regulated. I just wanted to shamelessly advocate some of my own publications. I've written some books and papers about regulating cannabis, and I've always advocated for a scenario for a non-for-profit cannabis market, because my idea is you could choose to commercialize cannabis, but at first sight, it does not seem to be a very good idea because we know the dangers of over-commercialization. So why not start cautiously when you try to regulate a cannabis market and create a first phase in which you regulate home cultivation for an individual at home, cannabis social clubs as a not-for-profit model, and medical cannabis distribution for patients who need it for medical applications. And once you've evaluated that very cautiously regulated cannabis model, you can still decide to adjust the model and allow more commercial players into the field. I'll stop there and refer to some of the publications. If any people here are interested in receiving some of these publications, you can just send me an email later on and I'll help you out with that. Thank you very much for the invitation once again.
Thank you very much, Prof. That was very insightful. I've actually, during my honors research on cannabis social clubs, I drew a lot on your and Mafalda's research to build my own projects and stuff. So that was very insightful. I would like to give over to Cobus to discuss the Goa model and cannabis social clubs within South Africa in a bit more detail. Thank you, Cobus.
Hi, Marika. Thanks a lot. It seems I've got a bit of an issue with my video. I'm just going to switch that off. It must be the beautiful sunshine at Onriboom Cannabis Social Club next to the Vaal River. Just had a lovely morning with some of the Chiba Cannabis Academy students, and it's truly amazing that we can sit in a place like this. And even more amazing to have an intro like this. Prof. Tom, I really appreciate it. It's so nice that we can pick up our heads a little bit and see what's happening outside and what has been happening internationally. And I think the Prof really summed it up well there, just explaining what cannabis social clubs are. I'm a Boersean, born and bred in the Northwest Province. I saw what the mining industry did to our area, and I think that drove me to start looking for opportunities where we can have renewable resources and we can uplift our communities and create opportunities and build an industry. So my wife and I have been running a cannabis social club in Oudtshoorn since 2018, December 2018. And from that was born Grow on Africa. So Grow on Africa has been operating for just over a year in its current format. And the reason why we decided to start this is that we were lacking these standards and these protocols that people that want to start up in social clubs could adhere to. So it was pretty simple to go and look at internationally what clubs have been doing, and then more specifically into commercial agriculture to see which standards and processes we could apply to set up clubs that are compliant to at least local and international standards, so that our members also have that safety of where the products are coming from and at what quality it is grown and cultivated. So what Grow on Africa basically is a self-regulating organization. We've helped 15 clubs open their doors so far, actually 17. We've had to close 2 clubs' doors as well due to non-compliance. And these are just individuals that are really keen to promote their local community and to get the cannabis community involved and possibly create a future in this and have a say in where the industry is going. Now, very early on, Mareike mentioned that it's a white panel and it's, you know, the exclusivity of the model at the moment. And that's been an issue for us since day one, because everybody knows that, you know, there were social clubs informally all across this country, groups of people getting their cannabis. But I mean, in that sense, all communities were included and dependent on. So I've been always explaining it to people that what these groups are busy doing now is writing the fine print and figuring out in the current legal state, and with the proposed legislation coming up, how can we operate these clubs where we run the least risk of offending and running into, you know, not breaking the stigma, and also running into trouble with law enforcement. So as this model becomes, and as all of these clubs develop further, it is actually becoming a lot more accessible. And currently, your only barrier to entry are the barriers that you set for yourself. So we've been, like I said, helping these clubs in terms of setting standards for cultivation compliance, things like processing compliance, and then also standards at the clubs themselves. So all these clubs can take, although these clubs can take on various forms and shapes, like the Prof mentioned, you know, that could be for pure recreational, could be a medicinal aspect to it. And then locally, we've got truly South African clubs that do stock fell versions of social clubs, where communities now share their resources to grow a crop, which is for the club. So what Grow on Africa basically did is we had a look at the current Zondo ruling, which says that adults can consume or possess, cultivate, consume the cannabis in private for their own consumption. And this is what we base our model on. So in a Grow on Africa affiliated club, these clubs have members that apply first as regular social club members. Clubs have regular events. It becomes like a second home. It's a real family. You can also then complete various cultivation SOPs and quizzes that explain the model to you fully. Some clubs only allow over 21s. Most clubs allow over 18s. Members register with their full IDs, their addresses, and then the model gets explained, where non-cultivating members are leasing property from cultivating members and directly employing them to grow their cannabis on their behalf. So what is unique in our model is that that is the interpretation that we're using, and this enables us to be paying all the relevant taxes on all of these cultivations as well. So I must be the only guy that gets really excited in tax season, because we've been able to pay UIF and pay as you earn on all the cultivation fees between members, as well as VAT on the lease fees if it's been rented from a VAT registered company. The clubs themselves charge the memberships. There's VAT associated with that. The associated grow shops pay their annual income taxes. So we've been very happy to contribute to the economy in that way. So I think how we can use it, I'm very excited that the prof said, you know, have a look at specific models, have a look at specific needs of the country so that we can see how we can make these different sectors work. And if I just fall back on our social club model, if you apply to become a member, you fill out the member needs assessment. So you have to tell your cultivating members in the club what cannabis you consume, how do you consume it, what do you require? And all of the supply that is then arranged between the members is based purely on the demand. And I think if we follow that same model and we have a look and we self-regulate these clubs to the extent where it becomes an example, we can determine from these clubs what the need in the community is. It's fascinating to drive from club to club and to see the different demographics, where people come in and have done their own research and are looking for specific terpene profiles that they can press into an oil. It's really opening up an industry. And as I said, I'm sitting at Onder die Boom, which is also the campus for Chiba Cannabis Academy. And it's incredible to see the progress that's being made. So I think if we can self-regulate, I'm not sure if our government is ready for legislation and regulations on cannabis social clubs specifically, but we feel that we have a very strong model that compares internationally, and all we're trying to do is taking international standards and protocols, using them in an African way. So for once, Africa can be, and South Africa can be world leaders in an industry, but we need to determine what that industry is and what it looks like. And if we can get the opportunity to showcase what the communities can do and how they want to be regulated, I feel that that is definitely a good way forward. We're very excited about what's lying ahead. There's a lot of opportunities. If all these COVID regulations allow us, we'll be having a very nice get-together in September at the Makofle campus. We'll be sending out invites and hopefully showcasing to industry leaders what these clubs have accomplished so far, and also making the introductions so that we can see how we can help shape this going forward. And I think as we go to the other panelists, it will become apparent how important the time is we're in now. There's a few guys with their heads on the block. There's a lot of people that are waiting with bated breath. And I truly feel now it's time for government to reply and take hands and see how we can move this forward. But in my mind, the Cannabis Social Club model in various shapes and forms, when complying to international standards, can really set the example and kick off an industry for us. Marijke, from me, there's not much else. I'm happy to take some questions. And yeah, thanks again for the opportunity. It's lovely what you guys are doing.
Awesome. I'll definitely ask you to zoom in a bit more about the different regulatory standards you guys are imposing in the Q&A session. But I would like to go to Neil Little now. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Marijke, and thanks to Tom for your input. It's quite fascinating to learn what's happening overseas. And Quibus, yeah, thanks for the discussion on the regulatory frameworks, the sort of interpretations that are on the go. My name is Neil Little, and I'm the founder of the Haze Club. So, you know, what sort of caused all these grow clubs to sort of start popping up was that monumental 2018 Concord ruling, which enabled private adults to cultivate and consume cannabis in private. So naturally, the question after that ruling was, can one grow for other people? And so we approached Schindler's at the time, and later Andrew McPherson, my attorney, will be speaking after me, to discuss exactly that question. So based on that advice, we set up our interpretation of the model. So the way that we set it up was very much determined by Paul Michael at Schindler's and Andrew's sort of feedback on the legality of that ruling. So the Haze Club, how it works in a nutshell is it's a member-based organization. Members send us their seeds. We grow their plants out for them, cure it nicely, package it, and send it back. And yeah, in a nutshell, so that the plant never belongs to the club. It always is the members' plant from conception right the way through. We are simply taking care of it. We are niched garden service in effect. So yeah, that's how our interpretation of how this model fits in with the 2018 ruling, making it legal. Yeah, so we started, we started operating in early 2019 after that 2018 ruling. Just started off with friends, and then friends of friends, and so the club grew organically like that. Something we have implemented, which we, as the club grew and it started to scale, tracking and tracing became a very important part of what we do. So in order to show accountability and whose plant is whose, and we had to develop a system whereby at all times we can show whose plant is whose, and nothing is going missing. So we approached a developer to help us build some track and trace software, which I think is going to be an important part of grow clubs going forward, especially our interpretation of that model where members own their plants at all times. So, when you start off with 5 members, you can keep track on a spreadsheet, but as you scale, it gets unmanageable to do so. So we've developed software specifically for our model, and hopefully we'll be able to share that with other clubs going our route in the future. Our club focuses on premium flower, premium cannabis, that was just a decision from personal experience. That's what the kind of cannabis I enjoy, and so that's what our niche offering was. I don't think that the model is limited to that, however. I think there is scope for all different kinds of grow clubs operating on the same model, just targeting different segments of the market. Yeah, so we had been operating since 2019, and near the end of last year, in October 2020, we were raided by South African police, which forced us to cease operations. Our equipment and all member plants and everything were confiscated, and criminal charges were laid against myself. So when I think Cobus says some of us have our heads on the chopping block, I think he's referring to me. And yeah, it's a scary time, but also the silver lining is that we have filed a declaratory order at the Cape High Court, which I think Andrew will get into a bit later. And the silver lining is that we will now get clarity on the model. So the industry will finally, have a proper legal framework to work on. Should we get the outcome that we are looking for. So yeah, now we sit and wait and see what happens. The fate of grow clubs, legal grow clubs, remains in the hands of the courts. And I think, Marika, yeah, that's Marika, that's all I have to say from my side. I'll stick around for questions a bit later. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Neil and Cobus both give us some insight into the operations of some cannabis social clubs within South Africa. And I would like to give it over to Andrew now to touch more on the points of legality and where we are with cannabis clubs in the current political landscape of South Africa. Thank you.
Hi, Marika. Thank you very much. And thanks, Neil and Cobus and Tom, for what you said earlier. Yeah, so So as this was said, I'm the attorney. I'm representing the Haze Club. I obviously have to limit what I can and can't say about the case. It's ongoing, and we obviously don't want to say anything that's going to jeopardize our prospects. The reason for the case is obviously the fact that Neil was arrested and the club has been shut down. We do believe that the model is totally legal, and Neil went through some of the main reasons for that, which is the fact that essentially the club operates as a gardening service. You send it your seed, and just to sort of provide a bit more detail on what Neil said, the club, the floor plan of the club is divided into grids, and a member essentially sublets that grid. And so that space is their private space, thus fitting into what was provided by the High Court in the Zondo judgment in 2018, which is that you can cultivate in private for personal use in private. So in our view, that fits into that definition of a private space, and therefore the model should be legal. It's obviously far more nuanced than that, but unfortunately I don't have the time to go into all of that. In a nutshell, the reason for the case is because the state has taken a very narrow interpretation of the readings that have been provided by Zondo. So just to be clear, in Zondo, they found that certain elements of the law as it stood, namely those that relate to privacy. In other words, what you do in your own house. Can you grow a plant in your garden, take it inside and smoke it? How can the state stop you? How can they interfere in that? And they found that by criminalizing that, they are unjustifiably limiting your constitutional right to privacy. And as such, the law was unconstitutional. And in order to cure the unconstitutionality of it, they needed to provide what they call legally a reading in, which is essentially where they insert terms into the definitions that are in the current acts. And that then, at least as a temporary measure, acts to cure that unconstitutionality. The court had actually given the state, the reading in is temporary, as I said, and then the matter gets referred back to Parliament for Parliament to then redraft the acts or whatever the case may be in order to cure that problem on a more permanent basis. As we know, the state didn't do anything in this regard. They were very late. They had until September last year. They do make the excuse of COVID, which is somewhat understandable. And then they released this Cannabis for Private Purposes bill, which is still in bill form, and is a very sort of, they allow for private use of cannabis in private by individuals, but that is it. They heavily criminalize everything outside of that, including ridiculous sentencing. But the other credible thing that we must note in that is that it does provide for an expungement of previous criminal records relating to cannabis. And that is important, and that must be commended, although it must be expanded. But ultimately, what this boils down to, and what our case even boils down to, is the state's interpretation of the readings in compared to those of myself and perhaps others in the legal community, and I'm sure those in the cannabis community. So just to give you an understanding, in terms of I'll call it the Drugs Act, it contains a definition of dealing or to deal in. And this means previously it was basically to do anything with any drug at any time, in a simplified sense. But now it says, any drug at any time other than the cultivation of cannabis by an adult in a private place for his or her personal consumption. That phrasing is the reading in that I referred to earlier. The difficulty here now is that it turns out that this phrasing is more ambiguous than it was at first intended. And that's obviously, when the Constitutional Court gave the reading in, they weren't in a position then to think of all potential consequences of how they're drafting it, because what they were putting was only meant to be temporary. But now, as a result of the 2 years Parliament had to draft it, those readings in have now become permanent, as that's what happens with reference to the judgment. So the difficulty here in that definition comes on the basis of the term cultivation. So cultivate in general means, to grow a plant, and that involves any of the processes involved, from planting a seed to watering it, to pruning it, to harvesting, curing, drying, whatever the case may be. But now the question is, who can cultivate for whom? The state's version, as has appeared from our case, which is obviously ongoing, is that cultivation must be done by the end user. So in other words, you can only cultivate for yourself, for your own personal use. And this, I don't know if it comes across to you, immediately the absurdities jump from the page, which is the fact that what if you are a paraplegic? What if you live in an informal settlement, in an informal structure in which your entire family shares a house? What if you're homeless, living on the street? What if you're a doctor working double shifts, or you live in a flat with a number of people? There are endless situations in which someone may not be in a position to grow their own cannabis. And then you've also, besides that, you've got the issues of having the knowledge and expertise, the training, the materials, the costs. If you're setting up an indoor grow, it's very expensive, and you need to know what you're doing to ensure that there's sufficient quality. And so in that sense, there's a multitude of instances in which it is required that somebody else can cultivate for you, or as Cobus had said, this sort of stokvel approach, which we refer to in our case as a socialized grow model, or socialized growing, which is in a basic sense where a community clubs together in a community garden, grows their cannabis, and then distributes the harvest to themselves. But currently that is outlawed. That's not allowed by the government. And therefore we end up in this absurd situation where they're saying the cultivation must only be for the end user. So then to extrapolate that, we say, okay, well, cultivation is any process in growing a plant. So does that mean if I send my son out to go and water my garden, and he, and I say there's a cannabis plant there, you're not allowed to do anything with it, but he waters, and I'm taking this to an extreme for a reason to make my point, is that if he then waters the plant next to it, and water then seeps into the ground and touches the root of that cannabis plant, now he is cultivating cannabis for somebody who's not the end user, for someone who's not him as the end user, and he is therefore, according to the Drugs Act, dealing in cannabis. So to make it a more sort of relevant example, if I'm growing cannabis at home and I don't know what I'm doing, and I call someone in to come and help me out, and they look at my plant and they say, oh, look, let's pull off these leaves, boom, he's dealing in cannabis because he's assisting in the cultivation process. This is obviously absurd. They need, and the other problem with this is it bars access to this law, to this reading in for a majority of the population. Most of the population doesn't have access to the facilities, the money, the knowledge, the time, in order to grow their own cannabis. As I guess I'm preaching to the converted here about the difficulties of cultivating cannabis. And the issue here for the state, and this is something that's coming up in our case, and I say watch this space, is that everybody, the reading in has created rights for everyone, which is the right to cultivate cannabis in private for personal use in private. That is now a law of general application. That means that law is applicable to every single person in the country. Therefore, if anybody is prevented from accessing those rights in terms of the law, that law is therefore unconstitutional. That law is of general application, and it must be available to every single person. Particularly so when you look at the reasons for why people can't access it, whether it be their physical abilities, if they're disabled, or it could be their socioeconomic status, or their job that's preventing them from doing any of this. Those are constitutional rights or constitutional reasons that these people cannot access these rights, and therefore on that basis, the reading in as it stands is somewhat unconstitutional, particularly if it's interpreted as the state maintains it is, which is this narrow interpretation of cultivation, which is obviously problematic. The view we've taken, on the other hand, is that the cultivation is not only to be done by an individual. It can't be that, because that results in the absurdities I've just referred to. The cultivation needs to be by anyone in order to the cultivation has to be by anyone in order to allow for the law to not be absurd, and to allow access to everyone, including the poorest of the poor, and even the homeless, who enjoy these rights too, although you wouldn't know that looking at how the government treats them. So that's the position from a legal standpoint. I mean, I can obviously bang on for years about this, but I'm going to leave it there, and I'll obviously be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for your input, Andrew. We're going to start with the Q&A session now. So all our attendees who are also joining on YouTube are more than welcome to send their questions on the chat line, which is being live monitored and forwarded to me to ask the panelists. I've already sent some questions, or collected some questions for our panelists. And I would like to ask Professor Tom some questions first. So one of the viewers, or I firstly asked you the question of what have been the results of criminalization of cannabis clubs in Belgium, and how does that compare to the formal regulation of clubs in Uruguay? Thank you.
Yes. Yes, thank you for that question. First of all, I have to say that many of the arguments I've heard here by different panelists, and seeing also the discussion being developed in the chat function, I do recognize a lot of things and a lot of arguments, in the sense that apart from the fact that cannabis social clubs, when they are created in some kind of a legal gray area, which probably is also the case in South Africa as we speak now, makes them very vulnerable. On the one hand, it's very important that there are these type of groups, and that there is a debate, and that there's also input from academics, for example, stressing and pointing at the importance of talking about this model, and talking about the different options society has to deal with the whole phenomenon. And cannabis activists and those people running cannabis social clubs in different European countries and in Uruguay have played an important role in fueling this debate and showing the politicians, showing the general population that there are ways to deviate from the illegal market and to create an alternative where people can safely go to get their supply of cannabis and use it. So it's very important that the model is showcased to the outside world. But on the other hand, the stories of the cannabis activists in Belgium, in my own country, and in some other countries are rather sad, in the sense that for maybe 10, 15, 20 years, they have advocated the model. They have created clubs. They have been able to operate for some time. But at one point in time, when the political winds change again, and times of toleration are over, and politicians think it's time to act or to show law and order, or to reinstall some kind of a zero tolerance ideology, they are criminalized. And in Belgium, for example, they used all kinds of indictments to try to criminalize these cannabis social clubs. They tried to tell the judge that they were a criminal organization. They united and cooperated to commit crimes. They were accused of promoting illegal drug use. They were accused of supplying a venue where drug use is allowed. This is a particular element in the Belgian drugs law that makes it forbidden to give a room or a space where people can use illegal drugs, etc. So they tried everything to criminalize them. And at a certain point in time, this had disastrous effects on some of the individuals and the activists. And we've seen the same thing happen in Spain with some of the pioneers of the cannabis social clubs being run there, that even after 15 or 20 years, in the lack of absence of a clear legal framework, they are still vulnerable for a type of criminalization. And the only effect, of course, is that the whole phenomenon is being pushed back underground, and cannabis users are being left back into the hands of the illegal market. And some of these activists have been ruined, both on the physical and psychological level and on the financial level. So my experience tells me that it's very important to try and establish a solid legal framework, which clearly defines the rights, and also the obligations, of course, but also the rights of those being involved in cannabis cultivation, whether it's to cover their own personal consumption or the personal consumption needs of the members of a club. So my general message is activists will remain very vulnerable. And we've seen the opposite in Uruguay, where the clubs are now legal. I've just looked it up while other panelists were talking. There's now 171 registered clubs in Uruguay, and together they have 5,152 members. These members have to register themselves in the post office as being a member of a cannabis social club. The clubs have to register themselves. They have to go through a lot of paperwork, but they are legally protected, unless they violate the guidelines and the legal obligations that they have to adhere to, they are protected, legally protected to consume, cultivate cannabis, to distribute that cannabis to their registered members, and the members are protected as well. This is the only right situation to give this model a future, and to also obviously make clear that there is a philosophy of legalization and regulation. I'm not very familiar with the South African law and jurisprudence and the societal debate, but I do recognize a lot of elements. And I do see that a privacy judgment, which is basically something about the importance of the privacy of the home, is not a full protection and not inspired by the idea of legally regulating the market, protecting some of the rights of consumers, distributors, sellers, producers, and on the other hand, still criminalizing other types of behavior. So I do think that the way forward, whether it's in the short run or in the long run, is to work towards a conscious decision to regulate the cannabis market and have a debate on which legal pillars will be part of that regulated model, whether it's home cultivation by individuals for themselves, whether it's cannabis social clubs as associations that just provide the service of cultivating cannabis, or whether it's other producers allowed into the field, or licensed organizations allowed into the field. It's all about legal protection. And I'll rest my case there. It's very important for activists that they will never be fully protected. And they can always, when the political winds, turn back into a war on drugs or law and order, or let's solve this problem for once and for all. You know, this kind of discourse on drugs, that it could end up in criminalizing a lot of people and pushing the phenomenon as quickly as possible back into the illegality.
Thank you very much, Professor Tom. I have another question for you, but I'm first going to go to all the other panelists, and then we can see if we can work through or work in another round of questions. I would like to ask Cobus if you could expand on the compliance measures in place in the Goa models and what he means by these self-regulatory standards that they have been developing. And just to give a bit more insight to our audience of how it works to become a club member. Thank you.
Thanks, Marijke. Yes, so the model is set up. If you look at and again, each club is an independent club. They have their own little special tweaks and things that are going on. But if I have to take a stock standard example, there's usually a PTY Limited, a business that has a grow shop or a pizza shop or coffee shop or something of the sorts, where they then rent an area to the social club. Now, a social club needs a constitution that draws up all the rules and what the membership fees are and how the club conducts itself. This constitution allows the club to elect a committee. The committee is personally responsible as a committee to keep the club within the constitution that they decided on. A lot of the clubs are NPOs, non-profit organizations, but most Goa clubs are non-profit companies. The legal compliance team decided to go that route because there's just more checks and balances in place with an NPC than with an NPO, like, for example, external annual audits and things like that. So the NPC would rent the clubhouse. This would be an area that's accessible to members only. Members follow an electronic link that explains the whole model to them and sets out the current legislation, also explains the proposed bill and how the model complies to the proposed bill. The application is then received by the club's committee. Each club has their own arrangements in place how often they sit to review these applications. A member is either application accepted or rejected. Clubs do have a geographical location limit and also a maximum member limit to the club. because it is a private members club. It's not just open to anyone that walks in. We capture a copy of your ID, any picture ID or driver's license, as well as a selfie photo, and then a digital signature. In the induction, it is explained that you are entering into a contract with the club and that they allowing the club to enter into these agreements, facilitated by Grow One Africa. So what Grow One Africa basically is a service provider that's developed software to make the management of the members just slightly easier. Cultivating members have to be members of a club first. They obviously create, or they are the people that can grow and does have space and are growing for themselves. They submit the base map and they follow standard operating procedures like signage and demarcations. Andrew mentioned earlier that Neil's grow site had demarcated spaces. This is exactly the same. So we've got spaces with 4 plants in, no more than 4 flowering plants, and that space is leased out with a lease agreement to another member. Secondly, the electronic platform also then facilitates the employment agreement where a member appoints someone to grow their cannabis for them. So again, at the facility, they must meet these standards, have their base map submitted, submit the grow plan so that we know which space this plant will occupy at every stage of cultivation. And then after that, we can allocate a grow plan to a non-cultivating member. As soon as they enter into all the agreements and have finished all their compliance scores, we do that in the form of online quizzes and questionnaires. Then they are able to become a sharing member, meaning that they can now have their plant cultivated in the system. So again, all of those standards for the cultivation side of it is purely based on good agricultural practices, and then the reporting using the electronic platform that we've developed. On the club side, there's also compliance measures that must be in place. I'm sitting around, I can see from anywhere in the smoking area, I can see that it's members only. No under 18 sign is up here. Cannabis consumption area, there's basic club rules. These guys don't let you drive under the influence. So it's like any other responsible business. There's just certain compliance measures to put in place. So yeah, that's basically how we've taken other industry standards, is not just applied it to the social club, so that we can help these people comply.
Thank you very much. My question for Neil is, why did you guys decide to operate largely on an online basis instead of having a physical space compared to other clubs? And what do you mean by premium cannabis?
Thanks, Mariki. So our model was dictated mostly by our legal advice that we sought, so and cost to a large extent. So we would love to have a clubhouse, but at our infancy, we just didn't have the capital to include that in our model. So it came down to legal advice and cost. In terms of premium cannabis, I mean, indoor, under lights, producers, if you grow in these kind of environments where climate control and you're growing indoors, you generally produce much higher quality flower, and that's sort of our model. We were growing under lights, indoors, climate controlled facility. So it's a lot more expensive to do that, obviously, but it produces high quality cannabis.
Thank you very much. And Andrew, sorry about that. My question for you is, why did you say that you guys believe that Cannabis Social Clubs is a legal model, and even though there aren't any formal regulation of CSCs in South Africa yet? And what makes a private grow and not commercial? Thank you.
Okay, so what makes a private grow not commercial is that it's for the members. It's not a commercial operation. I mean, commercialization is aimed at making profits, and so there is a very blurred line there. But the social clubs like that explained by Corbus is very much in that model, as you said. You know, where you're limiting the amount that you're growing to the amount declared by the members to be an amount that's needed on a monthly basis. On what basis do we say that the social club or the grow club model in Neil's instance, which is the one that we are obviously applying ourselves to, we say it's lawful, and this all goes back to the 2018 Zondo judgment, as Corbus and Neil both referred to, which allows for the growing in private, to grow cannabis in private for personal consumption. Here, what we're talking about is a cultivation, not the use, because obviously from a grow club perspective, you receive your cannabis once it's done, and you do what you want with it in the privacy of your own home. It's a cultivation aspect, and how, so you're entitled to cultivate in private. So the first step is it a private space? Yes, we say it is. It's not open to anyone in the public. The public can't just walk into the space. You have to be a member, you have to sign contracts, you have to be accepted as a member, and the list goes on. Yeah, I won't go into the detail there. It's a very nuanced debate, but that is our view on it, that it is a private space. And the cultivation that's taking place is purely from the club's perspective, a cultivation. They're not dealing in cannabis, they're not providing cannabis, they're not selling cannabis, they're doing nothing with cannabis. From their perspective, it may as well be tomatoes or something like that. It doesn't matter what it is, they are just providing a growing service. So in our view, it meets all the definitions of this it meets all the elements of the definition, which is that there's cultivation in private for use by an adult in a private place for his or her personal consumption. That private space, as I said, is a sublet demarcated area in the club. And so that is the member's personal space, in the same way that the flat you rent is your personal space, as is that little square. And therefore that is your private space where you cultivate, where your cannabis is cultivated for your personal use. The issue the state has is that someone else cannot cultivate your cannabis. And thus, because of that, they say they fall outside the definitions of the Drugs Act, and therefore they're dealing in cannabis, which is the charges that are faced.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so second round of questions. This time the questions are coming from the audience members. The first question I have is for Professor Tom, and the question is as follows. You briefly mentioned over-commercialization and the dangers thereof. Please expand on this. What does over-commercialization look like? How is it dangerous, and to whom?
Yes. So what I mean with over-commercialization is, in fact, what we saw that happened with alcohol and with tobacco and with the pharmaceutical industry. We know from the academic literature that advertising products, so marketing them, branding them, all types of advertising, does encourage consumption and does increase consumption in the general population, and might also increase abuse or substance-related problems. So when we talk about alcohol, when we talk about tobacco, we know that advertising has led to an increased consumption in the population and increased prevalence of substance-related problems. So it seems like a historical lesson that even though the dangers of many of these substances are overstated in the prohibitionist discourse and in the war on drugs discourse, there are risks related to excessive consumption and consumption at a young age. So there's a lot to say and a lot to argue in favor of a total ban of marketing and advertising. But that, in my view, would also imply banning advertising for alcohol. The only product that we have banned advertising for is tobacco, at least in Europe and in many parts of the world. Now, over-commercialization also means a multi-billion-dollar industry, which has the money to buy them all the lobbyists and all the influence that they need to influence the regulatory government or the regulatory authority. And I'm always looking at this phenomenon from the public health perspective. From a public health perspective, it is not a good idea to create a multi-billion-dollar industry, which has the money and the power and the influence to go against any attempt of the government to try and implement more strict regulation inspired by public health arguments. So it's quite important that the government creates a model in which they still have the power and the authority to regulate those that produce, those that distribute, those that consume, etc. So to me, that's why I showed the pictures in my slideshow of some of the products that the commercial industry in Colorado and Washington, those first states in the US that legalized cannabis according to a for-profit logic, you immediately create an industry which tries to invent all kinds of products that no cannabis user ever thought of and never needed. So you have an industry which creates a lot of products that are not even needed. There's no demand for that among the cannabis using community or population. It's the industry that comes up with this new type of products and then, of course, tries to sell them as much as possible. So I do think, but I do think the same about alcohol and about tobacco and about any other drug. This should be taken out of the illegal sphere. There's no use in prohibiting everything around these substances. But it makes sense from a public health perspective to create models, regulated models, that at least temper or decrease the adverse effects of over commercialization and of people that are in it for the money and not for protecting public health.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that insight. I'd like to ask Cobus another question. My question to you is to expand on cannabis stock files and maybe other practical ways we can take towards increasing the CSC cannabis club space, or yeah.
Yeah, I think the word stockfile has been thrown around a lot the last bit. I've seen interesting versions of it. But I mean, in true essence, a stockfile is a group of people that have a common goal. They draw up a budget. They see what their expenses are going to be over a period of time. They divvy that up into a member contribution, whether that be monthly, weekly, or whatever they decide. And with that money, they accomplish this common goal. So I can definitely see it fit in to a few interpretations of the current law. But you know, it's important to remember you can't just have a place where you grow for people and call it a stockfile. Really do your research before getting into a stockfile and make sure it is a true stockfile. Stockfiles are usually set up amongst groups of friends, and they don't tend to be massive when it comes to cannabis. It just starts becoming a nightmare to regulate. There's various models to look at. The NCOT-based club models allow for similar things to be done. You can have a premises and a clubhouse where you grow for the club based on this NCOT model. It's all European standards, so you know that what you're doing is in line with international standards at least. But again, like Andrew said, in the situation that Neil is in, government hasn't told us whether anyone else can grow your cannabis. Their view is that you can't even pick up the seed when it's in the street lying there. You have to have it, and you must grow it yourself, and no one else can do it for you. So just be careful of people punting models and telling you that you can buy into a franchise or they can help you set up. I think it's definitely it's all snake oil at this point.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Just to the panelists, you can see there are quite a few questions for you guys in the questions and answer session. You're more than welcome to answer in between. But I'd like to ask Neil the following question, which is, can you, wait, where is it now? Sorry. What are the benefits of being a member of a cannabis social club? for an individual?
Yeah, well, I think the first one is transparency. So you know, by being a member of a social club, you're legally accessing your cannabis. You are sending your seeds that you want to be grown, so you know what you're growing. So there's quality control in there. It's you're no longer going to the black market, which by its very nature is intransparent. You know, it's you have access to information and control, some form of control. So by the very least, I think those are the major benefits. Yeah.
Does anybody else from the panelists have something to add? Maybe you, Cobus, or
I can
yeah, I
speak.
think.
Apologies. Go for it, Cobus.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I think we're at a very interesting stage in where legislation is at, and you know, people. I've been trying to pull up the handbrake since 2018. We literally just wanted people to have the option to put an extra plant in your garden, to be able to cultivate for yourself. If you can grow more, grow for other people. And I think a lot of people confuse it with a commercial space where they are in a hurry and they want to set up a bunch of outlets and they want to have tunnels full of weed and then look for customers. So I think it's very important to realize that the Cannabis Social Club is just that. It's a hub. Cannabis is one of the benefits, and it is one of the draw cards, and it's a spearhead where we get the communities together. And I think that is the main reason why it has gone this way, where it's become almost an exclusive market, and it isn't. Isn't supposed to be at all. But the people that opened Cannabis Social Clubs in the last 2 years did so coming out of lockdown, rejuvenating new businesses, actually starting up pizzerias and coffee shops and having this extra thing as a Cannabis Social Club as an extra benefit. So I think the time is now to roll it out. I really think there's a lot of benefit to communities. My door is always open. There's a long list of people that I'm trying to get back to, and all I'm trying to do is to share what I've learned so far. So anybody that's interested in what we are doing, please make contact with any of the clubs. I think Mareike posted our link there, grow1.africa. And yeah, let me tell you, there's some exciting things happening just north of Soshanguve. There's some exciting things happening in the Eastern Cape with some cooperatives that are also very interested in the model. So yeah, watch this space, and yeah, please, our doors are always open.
thank you very much, Cobus. Andrew, you wanted to contribute?
Thank you. There's a great way of explaining this that I've sort of come across throughout this work, is that if you think back to the old days with piracy, online piracy and music, you know, back in the days, you know, there was Napster and all these things where people could go online and download music illegally, and it became a big issue and they started clamping down. And something that then emerged subsequently was iTunes, which gave people the opportunity to legally obtain music digitally. And the reason people went online to get the music was because in some instances they just couldn't get it in another form, or they found it to be overpriced, or whatever the case may be, so they went online. When iTunes came and people started paying whatever it was, 99 US cents a song or whatever, it showed people they don't want to pirate. It's not about getting something for free. It's about getting something in its most convenient, consumable form. And if that's available, they'll pay for it. The same we see with Netflix taking over from illegal downloading of movies. And that's what the clubs seek to propose here is, here's a formal way in which you can join a club, and we say legally, but obviously that's debatable at this point. It's the Netflix of cannabis. It's a way for you to obtain your cannabis legally and lawfully, and to avoid having to engage with the black market, you know, which, as we all know, is dangerous. It's risky. You put your life and on the line just to, you know, to get some cannabis. So it provides a much more accessible, safe way. Even if it's going to cost you more, it's still something that we're seeing people flock to.
Thank you. So my question for you, which is one of the last questions, you all are more than welcome to send through more questions you may have. So my question to you is, how would someone in a township who starts a club seek legal advice when the legal costs are quite high for setting up or maintaining a club?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, the first place to start would be to do your research online, as that there's a wealth of information available on the topic. So you could see exactly how to set up a club, and that would at least limit the legal advice you need to take to contextualizing that information into the local context. Yeah, I mean, legal costs are legal costs. There's nothing that can be done about that. And I think in a situation as volatile as this at present, you can't skip that step. You can try and model what you're doing on other clubs, but there's always going to be that risk. And I think when you're playing in such a volatile environment, it's important to, at the very least, have a relationship with an attorney who, if stuff happens, like with Neil, that we're in a position then to act immediately. Like we did with Neil, we applied and stayed the criminal prosecution pending the relief sought in the High Court with regards to the legality of grow club models and socialized growing. But unfortunately, it's legal advice is expensive, and there's not a lot of attorneys at present that are working in this space, and so you are somewhat limited. But you can always try and negotiate something with your attorney. I mean, for example, for Neil, his whole legal team is acting pro bono. It's a cause that everyone believes in. It's a cause that everyone wants to be part of. It's a big deal. It could, can make news. It's a very important cause. And I guess in that sense, I don't want to describe us as activists, but we're all fighting for the same cause. And in that respect, there might be scope for, for somebody to reach out for legal advice and the cost of it can be negotiated in that respect.
Thank you very much. There was a question in the chat line for me from Brett, which asked about how many cannabis social clubs there are currently operating in South Africa. And it's hard to say exactly how many cannabis social clubs are operating. Cobus can let us know exactly how many GOA clubs are operating at this exact stage, but many of the cannabis clubs are independent or not affiliated to a network. So, and they remain under the radar, so we don't necessarily know about them. But Cobus, can you tell us a bit more about how many clubs you guys have?
So currently there are 15 clubs that are using our services, and there's about 15 or 20 more in different phases of opening up their own club. Across the country, I've been invited to various openings, and look, there's, like you said, now there's so many different people doing so many different things, and that's why this is not a clear cut, is a cannabis social club legal, because it's all about the interpretation and then the application of your model. And just to add to what Andrew was saying there, I WhatsApped you a link, Mareike, to a to-do list to open a club. Like I said, all I'm trying to do is to share information. So you'll see that is exactly what we are doing and what all the independent clubs are doing that are affiliated with us and not affiliated with us, making use of our tech platforms or not. So you're welcome to share that link with participants as well. We've found that most clubs have a legal team on retainer because there's a few clubs that can use the same legal team. The retainer is quite affordable. And, it's very important. You have to look at everything from your property rights, your water rights, your labor relations. There's a lot of paperwork involved. And I think the cannabis community sometimes think that we are, that this is a special, unique, standalone industry. And this, it can't be further from the truth. There's a lot of other things happening and like special spin-offs from this industry, but we can apply so many and all of the other standards applicable to this industry. So you're welcome to share that. All the info is in there, educating people on the legal stance and then our interpretation. And like I said, there shouldn't be a barrier to entry. You just need to decide what it is you want to do and then find the right people who can help you with those specific things.
Thank you very much. The last question I want to pose to all the panelists and whoever decides they want to answer it can. is from Mrs. Butwini, and she says, Black people, as we all know, experience disproportionate punitive measures with regards to cannabis offences. Are there any concrete plans or even vague ideas of how we will counteract this issue? Go for it, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that can't be done from a public side. You know, you can lobby and you can protest, but unfortunately, that's something that has to come from the state. And we are seeing moves in that direction. When you see the bill I referred to earlier, the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill, they do make provision for expungement. And that's about as good as it gets right now. The state is taking a very punitive approach to cannabis. Anything outside of what they interpret to be the meaning of the Zondo judgment, they're coming down on you like a ton of bricks. We're seeing arrests every week, and you know, we're even seeing arrests of people growing cannabis in their own properties. You know, where the value of the cannabis is 80,000 rand. But when you look at the draft bill, they intend that a personal quantity of cannabis can be as much as 600 grams or 1.2 kilograms for a household. So, you know, those are ginormous quantities of cannabis. I mean, not for someone who's dealing, but for somebody who's for personal use. You know, it's well above and beyond. But the arrests are going to happen. You know, the systemic racism in the country and in the legal system in particular is not new, and it's something that we continue to battle, and we just have to deal with it as it comes. It is addressed slightly in the National Cannabis Master Plan, which I think people should all go and have a look at. It does deal with these sorts of issues, although the short answer is that there's no answer. That is the short answer.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who would like to contribute, or? Okay. To just give some personal input from my side on this, I think it is one of the biggest issues we are facing and continue to face, not necessarily just with like cannabis, but with many other like substances or cases where Black people are experiencing, as Mrs. Bedwini puts it, disproportionate punitive measures. I think in terms of cannabis, specifically, a lot of it has to do with, for example, the proposed cannabis bill, in which the laws ends up discriminating against people who are considered economically disadvantaged. And Black people don't necessarily have the resources to fight these cases and arrests in court. And even within the cannabis social club space, it's hard to access and afford to access these spaces of becoming a member in cannabis social clubs and becoming a grower itself, especially to put all the legal measures and in place. But as Andrew says, there is no real answer, but it's an issue that must be addressed in the future and continuously discussed so that we can develop practical solutions going forward. But I would like to say that we have about 5 minutes left. So I would like to offer the panelists the opportunity to say any last words they would like to before we close this webinar. We can start with Professor De Corte and then just go through the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marike. And I just wanted to end by thanking you again for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to meet new people in South Africa and extend the context here. I was pleased to be introduced to the other panelists. So I hope we can maintain contacts with you all and with other people in South Africa. I've tried to pinpoint at some publications in the chat function that we've done, and we're still working on other publications with some scholars from all over the world. So I've indicated that in the chat that we have been working very closely with Rosario Queirolo in Uruguay to study the Uruguayan experience with cannabis social clubs, with Melissa Bone in the UK, because the UK has recently seen an important increase in the number of cannabis social clubs as well. And then with Oscar Pares and some other Spanish colleagues to study the Cannabis Social Club practices as diverse as they are in Spain. And we continue to do our own work in Belgium as well. It would actually be very nice to continue and to start working with some people in South Africa as well, because this is not a debate limited to South Africa or Belgium or Spain. It's, as I said in the beginning, the world has become a laboratory, and there's a lot to be learned from each other's experiences. And this model and the discussions that were in this panel today about the rights of cultivators, the cannabis community, the social inequity, and the punitive responses to the communities of color, etc. These are almost universal points of debate, which are also raised in Canada, in the US, and in Europe, although our historical backgrounds are sometimes different and our histories are different. This is something which is overarching and will become an important battlefield in the next 10, 15 years. And probably not only cannabis, but also our drug policies in general. So it's very important that we network and that we work together and that we compare our experiences. So thanks for the invitation. I'd like to invite you all back for future collaboration and contacts.
Thank you, Professor de Korte. We'll definitely be in touch. Cobus?
Marijke, thanks a lot. And yeah, equally so, every panelist here, thanks so much for everything sacrificed so far and done so far. Guys, go and support your local cannabis social clubs. Go and have a look who the community is, see if you fit in. If you don't fit in, start your own thing. We live in a time where we have to look after ourselves, and this goes much wider and broader than just cannabis. Cannabis is just a luxury we can share sitting together, and we can empower while doing so. So get involved and get your voices heard, because this needs to go all the way up to the national executive. Someone needs to help us make a law that we can govern ourselves. And to the people out there that are doing such a sterling job of self-governing, self-regulating, and having an open source, model that that members can benefit from, thanks a lot. That's off to you. Yeah, and like I said, our door is always open, and I'm also looking forward to the collaborations leading from this. Thanks a lot.
Neil?
Thanks, Marijke. Yeah, and following on from what Cobus said, firstly, thanks to all the other panelists and everyone for attending. I just hope that our case that we're involved in can be successful and will open the door for everyone, for all clubs. Yeah, fingers crossed, and let's hope we get a positive result.
Andrew sadly got load-shedded, something which we all experience quite often, so he can't join to give his final comments. But I would like to thank everybody for joining today. I know that the time was very constrained and that we would love to continue these conversations. So what we're going to do is we've collected all of you guys' questions, and we're going to send these questions on to our panelists, who will then hopefully answer them in text. And we will share these answers to your questions on our social media. I'll share our details in the chat line again. But thank you very much for our panelists and our attendees for joining us on this discussion of cannabis social clubs, which is something that is quite new in South Africa and that we're not all necessarily familiar with. But hopefully soon we can continue this public debate, and there can be some significant developments on the THC case and hopefully regarding regulation on cannabis social clubs. We will share this webinar on our social media and our website as well. So you're more than welcome to share and rewatch later. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Marijke.
Thank you. asking about the Traditional Healers Act in the chat line. In case some people know, they don't have much to do with cannabis social clubs, but there are some people who use the legislation to dispense cannabis in public, and that's maybe something we can touch on in the future. Thank you.